What if the real barrier to economic mobility isn't employment, but the lack of stable housing to sustain it? We're going a little deep today, y'all. Good morning, and welcome to Disrupting Poverty Through Leadership That Delivers Results, AM Talk Show. I'm your host, Dr. Tekemia Dorsey, and today we're addressing one of the most foundational and often underestimated drivers of poverty: housing stability. Because without housing stability, opportunity cannot be sustained. Today's episode is entitled Housing Stability and Wealth Building: The Foundation of Poverty Disruption. Agenda 2030 in Action. Let's connect this to Agenda 2030. The Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG, that is Sustainable Development Goals 1, which is no poverty, SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, SDG 10, which is reduce inequalities, and SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. Highlight a critical truth: housing is not just a shelter, it is a platform for economic mobility and wealth creation. But here's the disconnect: we treat housing as a social issue instead of a strategic economic driver. We about to go deep, y'all. I absolutely love that. Let me repeat that again. We treat housing as a social issue instead of a strategic economic driver. Let's begin by understanding the connection between housing and economic stability. All right. And in order to do so, let's ground this in reality. A good friend of mine by the name of Tasha, a working professional, secured what we would call a stable job, right? But frequent moves due to rising rent caused Tasha disruption in transportation, increased expenses, stress, and instability. All of these factors are normal. We hear about it, we see about it, we read about it every day. And eventually for Tasha, her job performance declined because of these barriers, right? And the truth is, without stable housing, employment stability is also fragile. So, having disruption in transportation, increased expenses, stress, and instability caused Tasha not to do so well, right? And when her housing became unstable, so did her employment. And that's a problem. Housing is not separate from economic mobility. Housing is a foundation to economic mobility. Foundation is like clothes you put on, right? And once you put on those clothes, shirt, pants, socks, whatever, it allows you to do different things. Well, with stability in housing, whether it's an apartment or a home itself or some type of dwelling that is consistent, it allows that to be less of stress and anxiety and work being worrisome to more of stability, then allows the economic part of the economic threshold to thrive, right? So, housing is not separate from economic mobility. It is the foundation, it is foundational to it. So, if housing drives stability, what barriers are preventing access? Dr. Dorsey, it is too early to be thinking as deep. No, it's not, because if you're listening to this going to work or listening to this as I'm actually recording it or hosting it, then it's having you think differently as a leader and as in from an organizational standpoint. So again, if housing drives stability, what barriers are preventing access? Housing access is shaped by multiple systemic barriers. What are they, Dr. Dorsey? I am so glad you asked. Housing access is shaped by rising housing costs, increased prices, limited affordable housing supply, limitations, credit and lending challenges. Let's not get started on a credit score, and zoning and policy restrictions. Recently, a family qualified for a mortgage. Woo, yes. But lacked generational wealth for a down payment. Wonk, wonk. The opportunity existed, but access did not. And oftentimes we see this. I'm going to pause there for a minute because I happen to be on a very popular social site called Nextdoor. And Nextdoor is worldwide. I mean, it's global. Although you can connect to people in your community, you can also connect to people that's like on the West Coast. And here within my area, I just happened to read someone say that it is the governor and the mayor or county executive's fault why businesses are closing. Do you think it's truth to that? Maybe. But my response was, job businesses or entrepreneurs keeping their doors open is really due to their lack of or their thriving from. And it also ties back to this, right? The opportunity is there for entrepreneurs, businesses to open their doors and to thrive. But what prevents them from doing so is their mirrored image, their reflection, their credit score, their lack of banking, the lack of accounting, the lack of all of the above, right? And so before we can point fingers externally, we have to look internally. And that's the same thing, even from a housing standpoint. Families want stability in homes. They no longer want to rent. And who blames them, right? So you can qualify for a mortgage, but if you're not dotting the I's, crossing the T's, spending more than you're earning, then unfortunately, when it comes down to that down payment, you might not have it. And so that means that the access is not there, but not because that the opportunity wasn't available. We just wasn't ready for it. And oftentimes, whether it's entrepreneurship or housing or jobs, that's the catch 22. The opportunity is there, but the accessibility is more of a barrier now than a positive trait. So the truth about opportunities existing, but access not so much in housing is because housing systems often reinforce inequality instead of reducing it. But housing is not just about access, it is about quality and environment. Where people live affects health outcomes, the city versus the county, rural versus suburban versus inner city, right? It also impacts educational opportunities and employment access. Jordan, a client of mine, is a student at a local college, or their family. Jordan attends a local college, but their family is a client. And but unfortunately, being away at school, he's living in unstable housing conditions, which is often the case when you're thinking about students going away to school. Um, Universities are pulling in more enrollment than they have housing to accommodate those students, right? And the frequent moves that Jordan unfortunately had to take part in disrupted his schooling. Yeah. And as a result, there was a decline in academic performance. Man, it's early, but we're here getting it done. The frequent movement also had an impact on his long term opportunities. They were negatively impacted, and his housing conditions shape future outcomes, but not in a positive way. Now, let's shift from stability to wealth building, right? Because they are connected. Home ownership has historically been a pathway to wealth, if done right, right? But access remains unequal. Two families, similar incomes, right? One access home ownership, one remain in a rental hamster wheel cycle. Over time, one built equity, obviously the one family that purchased the home ownership. The other faced rising costs without asset growth. They flatline, and in some situations they decline. Housing determine who builds wealth and who does not. I know for me, I have my youngest two love bugs are seniors in college. I have an 18-year-old son, Ed Morehouse. He has one more semester, but he'll be done college at 18 with his second degree because he also has an associate's degree. And then I have a 19-year-old senior at Spelman that graduates on May 17th. So their long-term goal is to go straight for their PhD. Makes sense. They're young. They in a market that is, you know, there for them. They're business owners, so they can come right out and start working in their businesses, which just celebrated 6 years, right? Setting them up for success. But we talked about what they would do or what are options post graduate school, right? And they're like, hey, I want to get an apartment, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds good, but you got a whole house here. I said, think about it. Why go and pay almost $1,200 for an apartment, making someone else rich, and that's just rent. That's not furniture, that's not gas and electric, that's not food, and all these other things, right? Whereas you can remain home, which is your home, right? Until you finish your PhD program, if they choose to go that far, but at least their master's. Upon exiting their PhD programs, They can buy a joint house together, right? Get used to really being on your own because I'm not kicking rocks, hopefully, no time soon. So they move in together, learn what it means to be independent on their own, sharing bills, sharing space, sharing responsibilities. And then, as they deem fit to be ready to marry or move out, or whatever case might be, one can buy out the other, or that could be their rental property. And now they're building, they're now working on their they're really third property, but second in their name. And they now pull in income from the rental property while and using it as a starter home, right? Now off purchasing their next upgrading their home, and now they have 2.5 homes underneath their belt. One joint property, or unless one buy out the other, then their own property, but they're owning, not renting, and then they have their family home. We're going to make it make sense, right? And allowing the income from these properties to really work for them as they're moving towards their home that they want to settle in, right? So housing does determine who builds wealth and who does not, but it is really up to us as parents and leaders, not just within our homes, but within our organizations, to make sure that the younger generation understand what that means, right? My kids are not going out here paying $1,200, robbing Peter to pay Paul to fund Georgia just because you want to be on your own. When the time comes, you'll be ready and you'll be smart about it, right? For sure. So, getting back to this housing wealth, who gets and who doesn't, right? That is a conversation that parents, leaders, programs need to be having right away. Yes, you can jump ship and run to an apartment, but then you're going to be broke, living check to check. Why? For what you think is freedom to be broke? No, 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 no. Makes no sense. But anyway, so how do leaders create systems that expand access? Leaders must invest in affordable housing development. Mic drop, just talked about that, right? But I'm doing it for my own children, at least my youngest two. Leaders must support equity lending practices. Before you can support it, you got to know what it means. Leaders must align housing with workforce strategies. Make it make sense, right? Because if it's not making sense, it's not helping anybody. And leaders must advocate for policy changes. Absolutely, all day, every day. Speaking with a colleague not too long ago, a city aligned their housing strategy with workforce development. Sounds good. What does that mean? Workers live closer to the jobs. And I know of quite a few programs like that. Like, from my understanding, if you are an officer in Baltimore City, they want you to get a house in Baltimore City because that's where your work is, right? I think it's also the same thing for teachers. Makes sense. And as a result of doing so, they get a discount or something like that. Win win. I grew up in the city. I'm not going back. But anyway, yes. They not only did they invite workers to live closer to jobs, retention increased and economic stability improved. And having that type of model is extremely important. And in this case, it works. So alignment with the housing and workforce development strategy, alignment created opportunity. Extremely important. And finally, this must align with global goals. And those global goals are, again, includes Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030. And what does that mean? I've been talking about it for a while now. So hopefully you're tracking these conversations and you're tracking, the information about the sustainable development goals. And long story short, Agenda 2030 is the goal is to end poverty in 2030. Well, we're already in 2026, and who we currently have running the country, I don't know if those goals will be met. It might be 2060 now, but we can continue to put dents in it with hopes that we can get one step closer to success, right? So, Agenda 2030 emphasizes sustainable, inclusive communities. Housing is central to achieving that because housing is equated to economic stability. Housing is central to reducing inequality, and housing is central to achieving community resilience. Global goals require local housing solutions, but it's tough. It's tough on so many levels. And hats off to those that are out there that are fighting a fight, not just for housing stability, but for homeless, for shelters, for people that's just needing assistance, because that is a whole sector in a crisis that's really hard to put a dent in. So let's bring this into action. And you know what this means? We love leadership challenges. So here is your leadership challenge. Identify one housing related barrier impacting your community or workforce. Yeah. Calm down. I'm going to repeat it again. A little slower. Calm down. Okay. Identify one housing barrier impacting your community or workforce. Got it? Good. Align one strategy to improve housing access or stability. We're going deep, y'all. This is going to require you to really do some research. And then I want you to advocate for one policy or investment that supports housing equity. I loved everything about this episode. Everything. I'm so smart. Because here's the truth, right? You cannot disrupt poverty without addressing where people live. You cannot disrupt poverty without addressing where people live. And leaders who prioritize housing are the ones who create stable, sustainable pathways to economic mobility. Booyah! If this episode expanded your perspective, follow Disrupting Poverty Through Leadership That Delivers Results AM talk show. Share one way you are addressing housing stability in your leadership strategy. And tag a leader who understands that stability drives opportunity. Because disrupting poverty requires more than jobs, more than programs, a definite system and a pipeline. It also requires stable foundations, equitable systems, and leadership that connects it all. Thank you so much for joining in this wonderful episode again this morning. If you have not reviewed the other podcasts, please go back, take a look, take a listen, download, and share. Until the next episode, until the next time, dive into those leadership challenges. Push yourself to think and act outside the box. Pat yourself on the back on a job well done, and show up tomorrow morning for another great episode. Have a great day. Appreciate you. And until next time, be blessed.